Okay, good afternoon and good evening. Welcome. We're having a discussion today about the confluence of leadership, management, and future studies. This is the second in our Infovore student book discussion club, where we're looking for ways to consume media beyond our curriculum in Foresight through the University of Houston's MS in Foresight program. Today, we have a really interesting guest, author Bruce Rosenstein, who recently wrote Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way. Now, he's going to help us look at the not just the insight from management guru Peter Drucker, but also ways that we should be considering management within the context of futures and vice versa. When we look at the future and how that's a leadership issue, how they complement each other. Bruce, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Joe, for having me. I'm really excited to be here today and to talk with you and your colleagues. And just to give you the brief background on both me and my work related to Drucker, I have a really varied background. Currently, I'm the managing editor of a publication called Leader to Leader, which is a co-production of John Wiley, Josie Bass, and that's my part of the equation. And the Frances Hesselbein Leadership Institute in New York. And Frances Hesselbein is a really major figure in the leadership world. She did a lot of work with Peter Drucker back in the days when she was the CEO of the Girl Scouts of the USA. And Leader to Leader Institute was the previous name of the institute. As I said, it's now called the Frances Hesselbein Leadership Institute. But originally, back in 1990, when it started, it was the Peter F. Drucker Foundation for Nonprofit Management. So a big part of it is as managing editor of Leader to Leader. And I also have a background in the library and information science world. For many years, I've been an adjunct professor at Catholic University of America here in Washington, D.C. And for 21 years, I was in the media with USA Today newspaper as one of their corporate librarians. And while I was at the paper, I also wrote for the money section. I wrote about business and management books, and that's when I started writing about Peter, who's, as you know, the topic of my two books. So just to orient people on Peter Drucker, kind of give you the Cook's tour on Drucker, he was considered to be the father of modern management. He lived to be 95, and he died almost exactly 10 years ago, a little bit over 10 years ago. He was based in California. He was born in Austria, but he lived for the last 30-some-odd years of his life in Claremont, California, in Southern California. The Drucker School, where I was at a couple weeks ago for this Drucker Day, wouldn't it be cool to have a school named after use of the Peter F. Drucker and Masatoshi Ito School of Management at Claremont Graduate University. So Drucker was, as I said, he was considered to be the father of modern management. He had this multi-pronged career as a management professor, as an author, and as a consultant. And as a consultant, he ranged from nonprofits to governments, but also a number of large corporations like Procter & Gamble and General Electric, things along those lines. And I was very privileged to have started interviewing him and writing about him with USA Today. If you go to my website, if you go to brucerosenstein.com, I've linked to several of those stories. They're still online for free. But I got emboldened to decide to write a book, or actually what became two books. First book came out in 2002. I'm sorry, I started it in 2002, but didn't actually come out in 2009. Living in More Than One World, Peter Drucker's Wisdom Can Inspire and Transform Your Life. And then the new one, Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way. And so what I've done, really apropos to your class, what I've done is, even though Drucker did quite a bit of work on the future, on the concept of the future, it was woven into many, many of his books and articles. And this was really fascinating to me, but what happened was he didn't actually write one book where he pulled together everything on there. And I thought, well, if he didn't do it, I'm going to do it. So I went ahead and did a lot of research. As I said, I had interview material from Drucker. There's actually more direct interview material from Drucker in the first book than there is in the second. still some. I reached out to other thought leaders, and I also went to his own material and put in really good quotes from his own work on the future. So what I had to do, though, was to come up with what I felt were the 10 major elements of his work on the future. And I think it's important for you and your colleagues to realize that Drucker himself did not sit down somewhere and say, these are the 10 elements. It involved lots of research on my part to come up with what I felt were the top elements. And I think they're relevant for, as I said, I believe there was a big part of his success, which included, by the way, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which was just given to a new group of people a couple of weeks ago. It's the highest civilian honor in the United States. So he received that back in 2002, right around the time I wrote for, the big interview with him, feature story for USA Today. So it was a big part of his success, yet he didn't pull all of these things together. So for the purposes of our discussion, our Google Hangout today, I think it's important for me to just briefly outline what these things were. And the first is that the future is a mindset. The future is, how do you approach the future, and how do you keep it in mind when you're making your daily decisions about what you do, whether it's managing a business or managing another organization, or even if it's not strictly speaking a management function, but the whole idea, and certainly within leadership. I mean, the whole idea of leadership, or a big idea of leadership, is getting to a more desirable future than where you are now. So it's this idea that's in your mind. It's a mindset. And I feel that also that he just kind of said, you know, get over the idea of uncertainty. That uncertainty is baked into things, that the future is essentially unknown and unknowable. So you can't assume that the future is going to be an extension of today. However, the future is created by, it must be created. It can't just be happening to you. So the future is created, and it's created in the present moment by your thoughts, by your decisions, by your actions. And I think that's really, really important to keep in mind. He's not saying necessarily that you predict these things about the future and then you kind of see what happens. He's saying that there's got to be this creation aspect of it. He had this great thing called the future that has already happened. And I'm saying it's thinking of it in some sense of inevitability. And this is that, what are things out there, and this comes in this scanning thing that perhaps you're doing within your studies, is what's happening now? What are the things that have already happened? They're happening now. They've happened in maybe the recent past, but the full import has not yet been seen. So it's the future that's already happened. And what might that be? What are some things that are going on now that we will see the full effects later on? And then how can you take advantage of those in your management and in your leadership? But again, this whole idea of that these things are done in the present moment, the decisions in the present moment, but also how are we to find out? And this is where, and I know that libraries are not maybe necessarily a big part of what you all are doing now, but when I talk to library groups, and very often I do because of my background and my teaching at Catholic University, you know, I say to them that libraries and librarians are very well placed towards this idea of helping people find the future, helping the organizations find the future that has already happened. Another thing related to that is this whole idea of change, that Drucker felt that you should be, as organizations, as hard as it is, that they should be organized for constant change. It's kind of similar to uncertainty, you know, getting over the idea that uncertainty is such a bad thing, and that getting over the idea that change is such a bad thing, because as we all know, that lots of people really do equate change with something bad, rightly or wrongly. He also said that we need to be not only change agents but change leaders, which certainly speaks to what you said earlier about this whole idea of leadership and management and the future. Then really kind of sitting back and reflecting on what you're doing and how these things will impact you personally and certainly your organization. Really taking some time out, however it is you can, to reflect on that. Just a couple of other things is that I'm calling it remove and improve. What he did was much more wordy, systematic abandonment, which means that you periodically go through what it is you're doing and you decide, well, we don't need this anymore. It's outlived its usefulness. So we try to stop doing it or delegate it or whatever. And then you pair that with Kaizen, which is this idea of ongoing, daily, incremental improvement. But I thought a remove and improve kind of sounds better. And then just the other two things were innovation and entrepreneurship. Of course, these are very, very hot topics. But he had a book of that name back in 1985, which is, obviously a very long time ago. And those topics weren't quite as hot as they are now. And then the final element is risk, which to me is related to uncertainty and change. And he's again saying, get over the idea of risk, that there's risk in anything that you do, even things that don't seem risky. So just, and not even necessarily of minimizing risk, but looking out for what might be disruptive, where you think that there are possibilities of risk, but not letting it paralyze you, which is, I think, a big part of what he's saying. So doing nothing is not necessarily helpful either. Or doing nothing can be just as risky or more so as what we would perceive as taking a risk. So I think that, and I'd be happy to share with people, if you haven't seen the book, in the back of the book, if anyone wants to contact me, I have a reader's guide to Drucker, several pages in the back of Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way, where I flag different areas within his books where he did really kind of focus on the future.
Wow, that's very useful. I know that in reading several of Drucker's books, I saw segments that were super relevant to the future, but it would be great to have access to your guide about the elements that touched upon that, especially since I read an audiobook of your book, and so
cool.
it wasn't readily available to have that index. So yeah. I'll make sure I point out to my fellow Foresight students that we start taking a look at that reader's guide element.
That would be great, and maybe I can use this opportunity to show the book. Is this showing up? There we go. Okay, great.
Yeah, I highly recommend that Foresight students put this on your must-read book or must-read books list. Now, Bruce's book here, Creating Your Future the Peter Drucker Way, it's not a Foresight book, right? He's not writing as a Foresight professional, and that's really key to our industry. Is we're a multidisciplinary field. The true strength within our study is that we pull in all these really relevant studies and tangential fields. And it brings up this idea of, does that mean that leaders who are studying the future or want to be ready for the future have to be Renaissance people? Or do we want to just be able to hyper-focus within our industry? Do you have any insight, either from your own experience or what Peter Drucker might say about that?
I think that based on what I've seen and what I know of Drucker, I think a little bit of each would really help, because it's difficult to be a true Renaissance person. However, and I would class Drucker in that, I would class him as a Renaissance man. I certainly would. But I mean, not everybody can do that. Not everybody has the time or the proclivity to do that. But I think having a multitude of interests is really helpful. I mean, he said that, and it's just, you hear that from lots of people, that there's just a number of really good reasons, and that's kind of the basis of living in more than one world, of having this multitude of interests. And one practical reason for that, when you mention leadership for the future, is that he felt things like, let's say, volunteering, being on boards, just having these interests where you were out and you were mixing with people who you wouldn't maybe necessarily mix with during the getting out beyond your four walls, and during the workday, but also after the workday. So you are seeing these other things that are happening, and you're not necessarily blindsided by them. And reading what you can, and we all know reading can be difficult just because we all want to read lots of different things, and it's hard. But he was obviously an advocate for reading lots of different things. So I think that in answer to your question, we do, we need focus in lots of ways, but we also need to broaden ourselves. And you mentioned this idea of being transdisciplinarian. This is a big idea at the Drucker School, and not only at the Drucker School, but at the Claremont Graduate University, which it's part of. So this whole idea of being transdisciplinary, they use that term. If you go to the CGU website, you'll see it quite a bit, and they really believe in it, and I think for good reason. So I think that from what I can tell, the work that you all doing is really fascinating.
A lot of executives I speak with nowadays say that the idea of siloed titles and roles is outdated by now. We have to be ready and willing to move along to whatever the organization needs.
Right. In fact, mentioning that word silo, we all hear it, and sometimes we, our eyes can glaze over because you hear it so much. One book, and I've only read part of it, but what I've read, I would really recommend to your colleagues. Is it's a fairly new book called The Psych by Gillian Tett, and she's one of the editors of the Financial Times, and it's a really well-written book. And also a particularly cool thing about it is, before she became a journalist, she trained as an anthropologist. So she had this academic background as an anthropologist, and she translated this into business and management into some of the things that can happen when silos. I mean, she had one chapter about Sony and some of the problems that happened, I think, during maybe the 90s and the early 2000s when Sony became like way too siloed. So that is a danger, that whole thing of being too siloed, but yet how do you not become siloed? So I would recommend, when people have a chance, or maybe just to look a little bit online at Gillian Tett, T-E-T-T, from the Financial Times, the silo effect.
We'll definitely check it out. Now, I actually was greatly inspired in my direction and mission from reading Peter Drucker's Management. Right. I don't know if it was technically his magnum opus, but it certainly felt like it. And that gave me the idea that leaders have a responsibility to be future focused. And that's really my goal, is combining my studies of a Master of Science in Foresight with an MBA, not so that I can be a futurist and not just so I can be a manager, but so I can be a generic leader ready for the future, so position my organization as ready and flexible for the future. Now, do you think that we should be looking at management and leadership differently when we talk about the context of futures?
It's a really tough one, because I think in leadership, we as I said, it's such a big part of leadership is the idea of getting to this desired future, getting to a better future.
And so identifying that better future might be traditionally the realm of leadership, but maybe doing the steps to get there, would that be more management? Does it work that way?
I was going to say that the actual groundwork, and also the actual, because let's say maybe leaders are looking at longer time frames, but you have to take care of the present, so you have a future. So I think for managers, while I believe you do want them to be future focused as much as possible, you also want them really taking care of business in the organization now, and making sure that what needs to be done now is done while keeping an eye on the future. And so I think that this whole idea of maybe the split in duties, because sometimes the managers and leaders are going to be synonymous, but not always. I mean, some managers are just not going to be leaders, and that's just kind of the way it is. And I think vice versa. So when in Leader, the journal that I edit, one of the really cool things about Leader is that it's leaders writing for other leaders. So our readership is leaders, and our writers are either, let's say, CEOs or university presidents, or, as you know, the very common term of thought leaders, professors or very high-level consultants. So we don't use freelance writers. We don't use staff writers. Drucker, when he was alive, and this was before I became editor, but Drucker wrote for Leader to Leader, and there are actually there's a number of books. Again, these were before I became editor back in 2011, but in this series that Josie Bass put out, Leader to Leader books, there are actually 2 books called Leader of the Future, Leader of the Future and Leader of the Future 2. So people might want to just go check those out online and see some things that people wrote in there about the duties and the responsibilities, and really this whole idea of responsibility. I mean, Drucker was just so big on this whole idea of leaders and managers, that they had responsibilities, but they were responsible to their communities, they were responsible to their organizations, to a wide variety of stakeholders. You know, one of the things I did for the books was interview a number of his students, many of whom I still stay in touch with, his students. And one of his students told me something. This is when I very first started research on the first book in 2002, and it really fascinated me. I mean, she said that one of the things Drucker taught them was when you make a decision, you, especially if it's a really important decision, you think about not only is it good for, you know, you as an individual and good for your immediate stakeholders, but that you widened it, and you widen it to things like the community, but even to humankind, which I thought was just an incredibly cool thing. That what's the best decision for humankind? And think of what's playing now in the Paris climate talks, is that ideally people are thinking not only of their, you know, organizations in their countries, but what's good for humankind. Obviously that's difficult. But Drucker said, ideally, we should factor this into our decisions.
Sure, but there's responsibility there. We now work considering the web of known stakeholders, but maybe we should consider not only how the future kind of rains down on us from those stakeholders, but how our organization might be the keystone species or institution for a specific important future, and how do we want to represent that? What values and characteristics and direction, etc.
Exactly. That's a great way of putting it.
Now, you mentioned earlier the this concept that you synthesized from Drucker of remove and improve, a version of his systematic abandonment. Now, I believe we met at a seminar about leadership and the future of libraries.
Right.
We crossed paths in the library industry. There's this ongoing discussion about the future of libraries. Is it going to be more and different, or is it going to be a return to the core and doing what has succeeded in the past? And I flip-flop depending on where in my studies I am and what my role has been. But you know, when we talk about abandonment or purposeful abandonment, and that ties perfectly into his definition of Drucker's definitions of innovation. Now, so I get the sense that if I'm taking a second to get to my point here, but if we consider resilience and anti-fragility of how maybe the elements of our industry that might be most future ready, that might be most survivable, are the ones that are time tested. The print book isn't disappearing. Does that mean the future should be that core business model of the print book before? And so how does a leader kind of consider the future of our organization, balancing what has proven resilience with what the next or new opportunities might be?
I think that one thing is really getting a good handle on what is your present reality. So this will be different for every library, but I think it's really taking a good look at where things stand now and what you're doing. So in this idea of systematic abandonment, you're really looking, you're taking some sort of census, you're just taking an inventory, whatever you want to call it, about doing, and it could be that within lots of libraries that they're doing things that don't matter anymore, and that they're not really good at doing anymore, or other people can do. So as far as the, and I think it's going to be different, let's say, between special libraries and public and academic libraries as far as what they can stop doing and what they, and improve, because that the part of the remove and improve part, the Kaizen improve, is that you take what's there and then you improve that. And so this, in terms of books, I believe what's happened for a lot of libraries is looking very broadly at what a book means, and having not only the printed material but online versions and what have you, and then looking at the present reality of, for instance, one of the things I mentioned in Create Your Future is that people, and I believe that this is, and I'm going anecdotally here, but I'm pretty sure it's true. We all know that many fairly good-sized public library systems offer really tremendous access to fee-based databases that you would really not be able to get. Most people would not be able to get otherwise. But it's sort of an underutilized and underpublicized thing. Or maybe it's publicized in the wrong sort of way. And yet, as we know, that these libraries are spending tremendous amount of time, and there's a lot of computer upkeep to do it, and they're spending a lot of money, I mean, as well as time. So here you have this great benefit for people, but they're maybe not taking advantage of it as much as they can. So you have the book mechanism printed online in one way, and then you have this really wonderful thing of having these databases from all sorts of people like ProQuest and whatever, and there are many competitors. And I think that libraries need to make a better case for that. And I'm not exactly sure how that's done. Not all libraries can afford to have a dedicated marketing staff, let's say. But in terms of looking out at the future, I think that here's something that's, these databases, which many libraries have, there's benefit, and yet there are people out there within their constituency who really don't know of them. So I think that, to me, would come into this improve thing, say, we're going to keep these databases, maybe we'll drop some here and there, but here are the databases that really make sense. These things are expensive, so I get the most use out of them, and maybe that means more instruction, maybe that means more targeted marketing, but I think that's to me a concrete example of how that would work. And I also think it would show some leadership in the information community, saying, here are these great resources that you really can't get elsewhere. We're providing them to you for just your library card. You do it either here in the library or at home or at work or on the go. And these are cases that these institutions need to make.
Yeah, that's a really helpful angle. So switching over, you come from the news industry side, and which in some ways is very parallel to libraries. But something I'm curious about in this discussion is there a futures context for the relevance of news media, regardless of what type of media, print or online, etc.? And now, I'm not looking for a specific future of,
right,
but what's the role of critical current information for the citizenry looking to the future? Now, I know that sounds kind of like a leading question, but the reason it is a question is because there's a lot of debate about if we need to know every little detail, if a well-read person really just means understanding the classics and the themes and the patterns, or going back to how you mentioned scanning at the beginning, which absolutely fits into the Foresight model, if we really should and do need to be hypercurrent on a wide range of worldly topics.
I think that newspapers and magazines can play a great role in this, and one reason is simply because in the pre-online days, there really, something would come out in the newspaper one day, and it'd be pretty hard to access. You'd have to really work at it to access it otherwise. I mean, librarians could, by and large, but not to the extent that we can now. So it was kind of there, but the access wasn't great. Now the access is much, much better. It's enhanced to the nth degree. So I think that in terms of learning about the future through what's going on now, we have all this fantastic access, both through paid databases, but just through the web for the news organizations that still offer where there's no paywalls, let's say. And I think most people do gravitate towards those sources rather than ones that, in a perfect world, I would subscribe to all sorts of things that I really like online, but it's not a perfect world. But the point is that these things are out there and we can go back to them. Going back to USA Today as an example, my alma mater, I've noticed in recent times, in fact, I tweeted one of these out today, they've been running these City of the Future stories that have been really good. I'm not exactly sure how much I think some of them go in the print edition, but they're way enhanced online with video and all sorts of cool graphics, that sort of thing, where they're really, they're going to leaders in the field and they're getting out how the future could be, but not in a really heavy-duty long-term time frames, but really in the fairly near future, things that really could be doable. And so I think that newspapers and magazines, of course, Wired magazine, as we know, is a great example of that, where they're looking at the future, but they're doing it in a very grounded sort of way. And I think that's
important. Structural approach. A lot of what you said, even earlier today, really was in sync with the specific model and framework that Foresight professionals use. You mentioned the scanning, looking at the horizon systematically. You mentioned not relying overly on current conditions. I think your quote was, let me take a look at my notes real quick. Oh yeah, it's not safe to assume that the future is going to be an extension of today.
Right. That's
a basic tenet of the Foresight model, is that the baseline future, the extension of what we see now, is probably the least likely to happen. It's just a good starting point.
Yeah.
But you've also, in talking about these information resources, this touches upon Peter Drucker's real emphasis on the leader within the knowledge economy,
right,
this information world, and how the knowledge worker has really been important. If we see a bigger shift away from that, and because of changes in artificial intelligence, etc., whereas right now we have a really good anchor on knowledge work that robotics, etc., can't really compete with, if that changes, and we do move over and it becomes like the relational stuff that we have a niche for, does that mean that we might see a change in the important skills for what a future-ready manager should be? Should that shift over from intellects to emotional, or I don't know, do you have thoughts on that?
I think that it's such a big issue, and I've been trying to read a lot about that, about the disappearance of jobs, let's say, and how there was an article that I one of the things that I do in the special library class that I teach is I encourage people, and I include myself in this, to bring in an article that's not necessarily library science focused, but bring in an article that would affect the world of libraries. And one, keeping the spirit of doing something that I'm asking the students to do, where I would bring in articles too. And there was a fantastic article this summer in the Wall Street Journal, and it was about something to the effect of, who wrote these sections, a robot or a stock analyst? And it was all about how stock analysts, some of them were being disintermediated out of jobs because artificial intelligence is becoming so good that they don't really need people to do that kind of analysis. And of course, there's, as you can imagine, there's lots of feedback about that. But one quote really struck me, and I think it was from an executive from Morgan Stanley, and he said something to the effect of, our job, and not an exact quote here, but advance clients' thinking, not just report on what happened. And I thought that was so great. Like, how can we advance the thinking of the people who are going to be affected by all this? So it's if lots of things, if the equivalent of my book can be done by a robot in 5 years, which who knows, it could happen, then where does that leave someone like me? Where does it leave people who teach? If, of course, we're seeing that now, as you know, with the whole idea of MOOCs. If theoretically somebody can study with the top professor in a particular thing, then what do they need with somebody lower down the rung? So these are really big issues, but I have to feel that based on what I've read and what I know of Drucker's work, that the people who will thrive will be people who will accept that this is happening. You're not going to be able to stop it. But what can you add in the way of knowledge? And you mentioned emotions, and of course we all know the whole idea of emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman popularized. He's somebody who's written for Leader to Leader. That this is important in being empathetic with people. So this whole idea of how do you take these human qualities and really build them in so that you're in effect collaborating with artificial intelligence, with robots, which from what I can tell, all these things are only going to get better and better and better. And it used to be, as we know, that blue-collar type jobs were disintermediated, but now we're seeing this with the stock analysts and other things. We're seeing white-collar losing jobs too. So, and it just goes beyond jobs too, because it's a big. There's a big. If people who just really felt that their incomes were secure, and if a big part of their being was tied to their employment, if that overnight is not there, which could happen, then we need leadership to see what we can do about that, and how those people can be redirected in some way. And I think it's going to be a big challenge. It's already starting, but I think it's going to get more pronounced.
Sure. And you mentioned leadership there. There's a quote from Drucker's management that I pulled out saying the first job of management was to identify and anticipate impacts. And that sounds like, as you're talking about the responsibility for a manager, is to be able to look at these things and start thinking through, having that mindset you talked about at the beginning. And
Right.
If you were to define foresight, it would be suspiciously similar to this. So I see a melding, the maybe a very crucial skill set emerging in our economy is the ability to anticipatorily manage for and with the future.
That's a great way of putting it. Yes.
Can you, but before I let you go, can you give us a short spiel about your other book, about living in more than one world?
Sure. Living More Than One World is the first book. Came out in 2009. As I said, I had to have a lot of, use the word resilience earlier. Resilience because it took longer both to write, at least initially, than I thought, and it took much longer to get a book contract. One of my regrets is that Peter didn't live to see that I had a book contract. So when I interviewed him, one of times was on video, that he was feeling that I would get a book contract, but as I said, he passed away before I got that contract. So when we did this video interview, and it was done at the what's now the Drucker Institute in Claremont, that interview, it happened to be 7 months to the day before he died, and it was the only time, even though this concept, I would say, was something he talked about, it's the only time I know of he actually used this terminology of living in more than one world. And this whole idea of that you have a number of things going on in your life, partially so you're not overweighted in one area, partially if you lose your job, as we just talked about, so many people might have, if you have other things going on. It could be a part-time job, it could be volunteering, all sorts of things that it wouldn't kill you, if you lost that job. Also, in terms of leadership, he said, for a lot of people, leadership opportunities are not going to be in the cards for their current position, or not for a long time. But if they were with, let's say, a nonprofit or something like that, or an industry association, or a professional association, they'd learn a lot more about leadership, and they could become leaders in that way. So those things really went into this idea of living in more than one world. And I felt that I had to extend it, because I as I was listening to them, I used this term called total life came into my head. And I said, it sounds like you're talking about one's total life, one's family, one's friends, associations, things like that. And that's where he used the living in more than one world. And if you go to my website, there's a trailer to the video when he talks about that. So the trailer is just Drucker and title cards. And sometimes when I do events, I play we screen the full 20-minute video of me and Peter. But he uses that idea of living more than one world. So all of you look on my site, and it's just, as I said, very short 4-minute video, and see that, and see that he talks about it a little bit more in a little bit more depth. But to follow on with that, what I did was I said, okay, well, if there's going to be a total life, I have to sketch this out more for readers. So I came up with this thing, total life list, which has 14 parts to it. And again, this was not Peter sitting there saying these are the 14 parts. These are things that I came up with and then wrote about more in the book. And if people want to email me through my website, I will, if they don't have the first book, which I talk about it obviously in quite a lot of detail, I will email people what that list
Great.
is.
And the
so
website is
brucerosenstein.com.
And can you repeat your Twitter handle for us so we can make sure to follow along?
Yeah, it's at Bruce Rosenstein.
Okay, great. And the website is brucerosenstein.com.
Correct, yes.
So we'll definitely be adding both your books to our reading list. I really enjoyed Creating Your Future. That really helped open my eyes, and it also inspired me to want to pursue more of Drucker's writing. There's always more to learn from him. So the future is a mindset. That's a great takeaway for us today, and it turns out that it's a critical management mindset. It sounds like from our discussion.
Yeah.
So definitely. I highly recommend that you check out Bruce's books, check out his website. I'll give that video a watch, and follow him on Twitter. And I hope that we can continue to learn from each other. Thank you very much for your insights today, Bruce.
Thank you, Joe. It's a real pleasure being with you.
All right, take care. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.